Hi everybody, this is Steven. I'm back again to talk more about the Superman figures, or at least other ones that I have. Last time I covered one portion of them, and now we're continuing with part 2. And today we'll be discussing 6 different ones of Man of Steel. All of them made by DC Direct. Actually, most of them made by DC Direct, except one is made by DC Collectibles. So let's start with the first one right here. This is the first appearance Superman, the way he looked in the very first comic book published in June 1938, practically before World War II started. And he was published in Action Comics, what used to be known, a publication that used to be known as Action Comics back then. So, as you can see, he has a much smaller emblem on his chest, the way he was envisioned back then. He does come with a cloth cape, and there is no letter S on it at that time. There is red trunks, however, and the yellow belt, and the boots were blue in order to be changed pretty soon after that into red. And he has typical articulation because the figure was made by DC Direct. Very limited articulation, mostly in the knees, and here in the legs, at the hips, and the wrists, elbow, and shoulders, and of course the head can turn left to right. It's a solidly made figure. The only problem with it is, or at least a minor problem, is that the neck is a little bit too long. But I mean, that could be considered as a minor detail. He is sculpted in such a way to look like he's smiling, and he does have his famous hair curl, even then. And there is another version of this figure also done by DC Direct, except it was released as a part of a multi-pack of Superman figures through time, and it's called practically that, Superman Through Ages. And it contained 4 different Superman figures, actually 3 different Superman figures, and the 4th one was a Superman robot. Anyway, the figure in that box is practically the same mold, but with some differences. In that box set, the cape is not cloth, it's actually rubber cape, and the neck is shorter, and the facial expression is different. So those are some of the differences of this same figure in the box set. So that's as far as the first appearance goes. So we'll go on to the next one. That would be Superman Possessed, from the comic book story called Hush. And it's a story obviously involving Batman and the villains of Gotham, but Superman was involved in it due to the fact that Poison Ivy sprayed him with a sort of a plant powder that made him become possessed so that she could use him to defeat Batman. So this is how he was created by DC Direct and molded to practically resemble his state when he got possessed by that plant. And you can see the plant being molded around his neck, meaning that it was able to get a hold of him. And the face, it's kind of hard to tell, but the eyes are sort of dark and lifeless, and he also has some of that plant matter. I thought it was a powder plant. I mean, the plant crushed into powder, but not really. It's more of a actual plant, and it has some of it also molded around his wrist as well, and it goes all the way around. And the cape is torn up, as if he was in a heavy barrel, and it does have the yellow shield at the back. He also came with a Batman's plastic stand, and with a small metal piece that could attach to make him look like he's floating. I do still have the plastic stand, but the little metal piece, I may misplaced it, and I'm not sure where it is right now, but yeah, so this is Superman and possessed by Poison Ivy in the comic book story called Hush. After him, we're going to move on to yet another version of Superman based on comics, because most of these are, pretty much all of them, and that would be Superman Lost Son. This figure was also made by DC Direct, and he came with a plastic stand that resembles his insignia, and he also luckily has the letter S at the back of the cape, which I find quite important. When he's without it, it just doesn't seem right. He was released with the 3 other figures in a single wave. Second one being Bizarro, who is much bulkier and bigger than him, and then also General Zod and Ursa, his 2 enemies that also showed up in the old Superman movies, specifically in Superman Part 2. Anyway, what else can be said? That there is also a slight interesting detail on the belt buckle, that it's also shaped like a Superman insignia right here. Other than that, everything else about the costume looks the same, like the classic version. And as I said, he comes from a comic book story called Superman Lost Son, and when I say son, I mean S-O-N, so son, not S-U-N. Anyway, I am not familiar with that story, I only heard about the title. But other than that, I think this is a very solidly made figure, and it came out pretty well. Next one that we could talk about as well comes from a different story by Frank Millar called The Dark Knight Returns. That story came in the first part, and of course the sequel. And how is Superman fitting into that story? Well, somewhere along the line, him and Batman end up fighting, because the government got him involved, and it so happens that he had to stop Batman. It's quite a interesting story, but you guys would have to read it in order to get the whole point. But anyway, he looks quite bulky, and again, this one is made by DC Direct, and this is the first version of the figure, but there is another version that was released many years later, barely a few years back, by DC Collectibles, which is a new name for DC Direct, and it's exactly the same figure with only one single difference. That newer figure of him, the reissue, came with much brighter colors. Other than that, it's pretty much the same, and it has the same plastic stand that it comes with. Anyway, he's quite muscular and buffed up, and he has a huge belt buckle, and he also has quite a large insignia on his cape, and it's definitely a different look for him. He's much bulkier than usual, but he still looks good. Now, the next one after him that we'll take a quick look at would be the Superman envisioned and drawn by Alex Ross. Alex Ross being a known artist in the comic book industry, and this particular Superman is based on his vision of him. Now, what's interesting about Alex Ross's representations of superheroes and villains, he represents them pretty much in such a way that you almost get the impression that that's how, for example, in this case, Superman would look like if he really did exist in real life. He comes with quite a large symbol of his letter S, and at the back there is no letter S. This time it's skipped, and the cape is made of soft rubber. There is the usual articulation throughout the figure, which is to be expected from DC Direct back in the day. And this same body, on which which was used for the figure, was reused several more times for different versions of Superman, but in each case the colors would be a little bit brighter and the head would be different, but it was reused more than once, more than just for this figure. He was released with a couple of other characters, and the whole Alex Ross action figure series were released in several different waves. Superman and Bizarro and Flash, and I think one or two more were definitely they were part of the first wave, and then more waves came later on. Now, the final figure that I will talk about today is this Superman right here, and I believe I already talked a bit about him in one of the other videos. This is Superman based on the New 52 storyline, and this figure was made by DC Collectibles, and it's still DC directed, it's just a new name. And you can tell the costume is quite different. There is no red trunks, there is no yellow belt, so he was envisioned to look like this in the new century, and he does have the insignia on the cape, except it's very dark and it's not yellow anymore. This is sort of a more moodier, darker impression of Superman. Not that it impresses me much. I am a big fan of the classic look and the classic costume. And this same figure was released in two different versions. This would be a single card version, and there is a version that came in a boxed set with a different facial expression that looks more serious. Here he looks a little bit like he has a smirk or a smile. Other than that, again, the belt looks quite different from the classic one, and the rest of the costume has some sort of details engraved throughout it. Other than that, this is still supposed to be Superman, but for the newer times and the newer generations. What else can I say? He came also. He showed up mostly in the comic books before the figure was made, and Mattel also made this figure once, but it didn't come out that well as this one did. And he was wearing this costume for comic books, and of course as a figure, and for a few animated movies that came out as well. There is news now that he will probably be wearing the trunks once more. We'll see if they will make a figure of him, how he will look in yet again a new redesign of him. So what can I say? Again, the articulation remains pretty much the same, just like back in the DC Direct days. No improvements really, it's still the same. No waistline movements and any fancy articulation of any kind, but he still looks good for what he is. So anyway, that would be today's discussion about part 2 of the Superman figure talk. I intend to continue with at least part 3 of the Superman figures. After that, I will try and talk about Superman's enemies and allies in separate videos. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you guys next time. Bye.